If you are struggling to get adoption from your team, from your company, from your coworkers on a process that you built, let me show you exactly why that is happening and the exact fix that I use with every client that I work with to guarantee 100% adoption on every single process that I build. Now, there's only one reason that your processes are not getting adopted. I'm going to show you exactly why using this visual. And this is going to be a very specific example for IT, but can literally be applied across any process that exists. I'll use a few different scenarios, but I'll primarily be sharing IT because it's a very clear example. And that example is we have a portal for IT and the alternative. The intended process is the portal, going to a portal, submitting a request. The alternative or the bypass is literally anything else. So it could be a Slack DM, an email, a walk-up, whatever it is. It's not the intended solution, and it's the alternative. Now we have this little purple circle here, and we're gonna imagine this funnel as having gravity and pulling things down into one of these two buckets. And this request can either fall into the bypass or the portal. So here's the mistake that I see almost every single company making. They add friction to the intended process. And I could add things like required fields, too many options, prerequisites. And then what I end up doing is when a request comes in, it's just met with so much friction on the intended process that people using this process just end up flowing directly into the alternative, and they bypass the solution that you want them to go to. Now, this is a very clear example because I've seen a lot of IT teams do this. They add more friction, but this can also apply to any process. You could have a workflow with way too many statuses, way too many restrictions, way too many required fields on creation, requirements and conditional logic, and more required fields on transitions. You're just adding more friction the further you go in the process, and the harder you make it for someone to actually use that process because they will just go to the path of least friction. And they will use the process that has essentially the least amount of effort for that individual to get the result that they're looking for. And in the case of IT, we're adding too many required fields, too many request types, too much prerequisites, and then people just end up flowing to the bypass option. And they go to Slack because it's easier, they send an email because it's quicker, they walk up because they think they'll get a resolution faster, and they're bypassing the alternative, or they're using the alternative to bypass the primary way that you want them to submit a request. Now, there's really one of two ways we can fix this. Ideally, we use both, and I've seen a lot of companies use option one. I've seen very, very few companies use option two. Now, option one, we need to remove friction from the intended process. So let's say we strip back the amount of required fields. Let's say we get rid of too many options. Maybe we have only a couple left. And then we remove almost all of our prerequisites from our forms. Now, what you'll see here is that we can do our best to reduce the amount of friction on the intended process. The problem is that we can never get this down to zero because you can't have a request type, a form, whatever process you're building that needs more context, needs more information for reporting, for agents to be able to do their work, for employees to do their work, it's always going to include some kind of friction that still sort of drives people over to the alternative, which in some cases could just be not using the process at all. Task tracking is a really great example of that. If you have a task tracking solution, a lot of teams just might not track all of their tasks that they have. They might track a part of their tasks or none of their tasks if you're kind of not keeping up to date and keeping track of everything that's happening. So step one is we want to remove as much friction as possible from the process as we possibly can. And again, for the example of IT, we're removing required fields, we're removing too many options, too many restrictions, and we're removing prerequisites for actually submitting a request. But the second thing that most teams don't do is making the alternative harder. So if we have a bypass option, what we could do is we could pull in and add something like slower response times. We could add a lower default priority. We can add accountability. So for example, if you send a Slack message and it gets lost, you could say that anything that isn't inside of the Jira Service Management portal is not going to be accounted for. So if you do send a Slack DM, we forget about it. There's really not much we can do about it because there is no record of it in Jira. So what we do is we add more friction and we layer this on and we make the alternative harder. And now when we have a request type that flows into this funnel, it ideally gets guided into the intended process. And it's going to fall wherever the easiest path for it is. And if you're getting a walk up and you say, hey, anybody who walks up or sends a Slack message or who doesn't use the portal, we're going to immediately dock your response time by 2 hours. 4 hours, maybe even a day. And your default priority is going to be low, and you're not going to have any accountability for tasks that are lost or not completed. I can almost guarantee you that a lot more people are going to start using the intended process because they want faster response times. They want faster resolutions. They want higher priority to actually have someone action on it quicker. And they want accountability. That way they know for a fact that their requests are actually being looked at and eventually being resolved. So that's really the trick here. And it really just boils down to two things. And you want to make following easier than bypassing in one of two ways. You make the intended process simpler, or number two, you make the alternative harder. Number two is really where most people go wrong. There's a lot of things that you could do to artificially make the alternative harder, like I just showed. But even if you're using a standard workflow for a standard work management team, if you have too many workflows or too many workflow statuses, too many required fields, too much fields on creation, and you overwhelm people whenever they're using that system or process. And every single status change from to do to in progress to in review requires more fields and more input and more information. Why do you think your team is avoiding the process? It's because you made it so difficult that they don't want to use it. So the goal here is let's make the process simpler, less is more, and let's make the alternative harder. And we can incentivize our teams, we can incentivize our company, we can incentivize the people around us to actually use the intended process that we are creating. And by doing that, we make following easier than bypassing. And a really specific story of an IT team I actually worked with around 2 years ago to do this. When I first started working with them, we came in and they told me they've tried to deploy Portal 3 separate times. And none of the times, it didn't work any of the times, it was completely unsuccessful. And they told me that the portal just does not work for their company and it's not a good option for them. And I asked to see the portal. I was just curious, what it looked like, see what the request types were, what the terminology looked like, what the required fields were. And I kid you not, I believe there were 9 or 10 request groups, and then around 5 or 6 request types in each group. And if you count all of that up, that equals to roughly about 50 total request types. I don't know about you, but if I'm an end user who's not very technically savvy and I have to go through and read through 50 separate request types on a portal to find what I actually need to submit, I'm probably not going to do that. It probably would take me 20 or 30 minutes just trying to figure out what option I need to submit. And not only that, it was littered with complex terminology, things like incidents, service requests, change management, things that the typical end user doesn't even know what they mean. And when you create a group that says, create a service request, I might not even know what that means. I, as an end user who's not technically savvy, would literally just want to see my laptop is broken, my account doesn't work, I can't log in, something literally as simple as that. And lastly, we looked at their actual required fields. They didn't use any conditional logic in their required fields, and the amount of fields that they had were around 20 to 30 on average that were required per request type. So just to recap, someone who's not technically savvy jumps in, has to read through a whole bunch of different request types, has to go through and understand complex terminology, and submit countless fields to actually get something into the system for them to have a small problem or even a large problem resolved. Now, you might be looking at that and saying, well, obviously no one's going to use that, but we do this in a lot of our processes. We add required fields on creation of work. We add required fields in every step of the work. We add way too many statuses to our workflow. We add more friction than that should be needed there. And we do this because we think the more robust this is, the more information we track and collect, the more beneficial it's going to be for reporting, for usability, the better the system and process is going to be, when in fact, it's literally the exact opposite. We want to strip that all away. And what we did with that IT company was we literally took it down to 3 total request groups and around 3 to 5 request types per group. And I think we landed on 12 total request types. And that is a whole lot more manageable than 50. So you don't have to read through all 50. You typically go through a group that says, I have a hardware problem, I have a software problem, or we had one for like onboarding and turnover, employee turnover, and you would click on the option you want, and then you'd pick one of 3 or 4 options. And it was very easy to understand, very quick to actually go in and submit a request. And there was a lot more conditional logic, which brought the total field count down to roughly 5 required fields per request type. So something that would have maybe taken you 10 to 30 minutes to submit before, now maybe takes you 2 to 5 minutes. And that alone, when we implemented this new portal, after just 1 month, we saw nearly 70% adoption from the entire organization. And then what we did was we layered on some friction to the alternative. And for the past 2 years, they've been doing portal only, and they have had very, very minimal, if not no requests coming in outside of the portal in the entire organization. Because when you set that standard, when you have those very clear options, and when you make that process simple with the alternative harder, and you make following easier than bypassing, people will actually use that process. And you might be looking at this and saying, well, making following easier than bypassing, obviously, duh, but you'd be surprised again at how many teams I've worked with, jumped in with, and seen how much friction they actually have in the processes that they create. And my kind of outlook on this is less is always more. Make sure it's easy and fun and enjoyable to use the processes that you build. And I also kind of think of them as being invisible. And when you think of them being invisible, it really should just feel like work is happening. Work is happening, things are tracked, things are moving along, and it doesn't feel like you need to keep some kind of system or software or tooling up to date. You feel like work just flows and happens, and it kind of just blends into the background of what you're doing, and you don't have to intentionally really ever think about it. That's the goal of everything that I'm trying to build. Now, there's a lot of ways that this can sort of go wrong in Jira, and a lot of options and creative ways that you can and cannot or should not implement this. In Jira alone, there's countless options that you can implement. There's screens you could add, there's workflow statuses that you could remove, there's required fields that you could remove, creation screens that you could adjust. There's just countless ways to actually do this. Really, the biggest thing is, should you or should you not do it? Because there's so many options available to you. And if you want to build better processes, and if you're kind of sitting there nodding your head along thinking, yes, I've built processes before and I've had so much trouble getting adoption for the processes that I've built in Jira, you could check out our website. Just click the link in the description. In there, you could see a little bit about our Jira strategy, because that's literally what our Jira strategy was designed to solve. And when you click the Jira strategy, you could book a call with me. I could jump on with you and we could go over how you're using Jira, some of the processes around that, and how we could potentially help you and your team build better processes that actually get adoption. So if you feel like you're getting stuck, if you feel like this is something that you could use help on, check out the Jira strategy, book a call with me, and I would love to work with you. I'll see you there.